When did you become a conservative? You were a Democrat, after all. You were an FDR, like many
Oh yes, yes.
other Straussians. You were
But
an FDR Democrat.
What kept me a Democrat during the 1950s, though, I had been, of course, a great fan of Adlai Stevenson, like all the other Straussians I knew. But the fact that in the Senate, the Hawks were all Democrats. Scoop Jackson was the leader of that movement, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And people, I heard just today on the radio that, well, why the Democratic Party is not the Democratic Party that we want to do under FDR or do a time of Scoop Jackson. And
so it was because you're saying of the anti-communism of the Democrats versus the reputation for the lingering reputation for isolationism on the Republican
not
side?
so lingering. The National Review was still spouting isolationism in its early issues. There was I forget.
It was vigorously anti-communist, though, from the very beginning.
Yes, yes. So was
America First.
Bob Taft was there.
Yes.
But he was the best friend the commies had in this country. He contributed a lot in the post-war period by trying to bring the boys home from Europe as fast and as completely as possible, leaving Europe exposed to the power of the Red Army, which was the dominant factor in the Cold War.
But in a way, you're only building the suspense. Despite all this, you become a Republican and a conservative.
One of the books which certainly influenced me greatly was Hayek's Road to Serfdom,
mm-hmm.
which was certainly a non-Straussian book, but I thought gave a clear demonstration as to why the controlled economy turns into despotism. Is despotism even before it becomes conscious of itself.
Do you remember when you read that book? It was published in 1944, I believe.
44, 46.
I think before 45. I think it was 40. I think
I read it not long after its publication. And one of the curious things about Road to Serfdom is that in other writings, Hayek said placed the choice of the free market as a result of the evolutionary process. It had proved its superiority by its results, whereas in Road to Serfdom, he had proved it by its reason.
Mm-hmm.
And Marlowe Lewis wrote an article which was published in National Review reproaching Hayek for that. But evolutionism has taken over completely, I think, the whole free market argument today.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, it's true that Hayek certainly became more evolutionist as he got older. He'd always been somewhat that way, even in his epistemological writings, as well as his economic writing. But what any other books besides Hayek's that influenced you? When did you actually make the turn? And by the way, chronologically, when did you?
Well, I can say when I changed my party registration, and that was after the Bay of Pigs, because I was remember Kennedy campaigned. One of his main campaign principles was that Eisenhower had allowed what's the word?
Or the missile gap.
Missile gap. That's right. And it turned out that there was a missile gap, but it was on our side, not on their side. and when Kennedy went to Paris to meet Khrushchev, he came back and said, "How can you? What is it? The word? How can you negotiate with a man who says that what's mine is mine and what's yours is negotiable?" And then he proceeded.
Great line.
Then he went ahead and negotiated. And that's when Khrushchev said this guy was soft, that he could overcome the missile gap by putting short-range missiles in Cuba. And then at least Kennedy discovered a little backbone that he didn't know he had.
Well, that's interesting. So, but was it...
that was
that was an event that was important to your conversion, as it were. But is that because
By the way,
this was
Ronald
an
Reagan,
instance of Kennedy's personal weakness, or did you see this as emblematic of the party, the Democratic Party, and the liberal understanding of the world?
well, the Democratic Party during the years of Scoop Jackson reign, so to speak, as an icon, split wide open on that question. A lot of Democrats became Republicans,
But you were certainly ahead of that trend. I mean, that's the late 60s, early 70s. You were already crossing over after 62 sometime. And by 64, you're not only a Republican, you're an advisor to Goldwater, to Barry Goldwater, and helping to writing the most of, at any rate, his famous acceptance speech.
That's a funny story. It's that I was not much of an advisor because the people around Goldwater clustered around him so thick that I just got and was so jealous of their influence, and I was not going to trying to become influential by displacing any of them. But when the campaign was over and the election was over, all I wanted to do was to get back to the academy and to the classroom.
Mm. Would it be safe to say that your political evolution was in advance of your fellow students of Strauss and even Strauss himself?
Well, as far as Strauss himself was, at one point I was putting together a list of academics for Goldwater, and I called up Strauss and asked him, and he agreed immediately to have his name put on that list. As it happened, before it was published, I took the name off the list.
Is that right? Why?
Because I thought it would endanger his chances of teaching after 65, which he was just turning about that time.
Oh, age 65, he was turning age, yeah.
That was still retirement age until federal law abolished.
Mm-hmm. Much later, yes. Yeah. And any other books, to return to that question briefly, that influenced you rightward besides Hayek? Did you read Capitalism and Freedom by Friedman, or
not as a propelling influence? Mm-hmm. It's kind of hard for me to locate because my passions were divided on the different issues. I certainly was against the isolationism of the Republicans, and I gradually.
But by then, certainly, I mean, National Review was heavily invested in winning the Cold War, fighting and winning the Cold War. It wasn't really isolationist anymore. And the movement, I mean, that Goldwater was not isolationist in any serious sense, which is what attracted you to him, I see. That's what attracted you to him, right? He was a more vigorous anti-communist.
Yeah, well, particularly after the Bay of Pigs, I saw that I placed no hope in Kennedy or the people, the other Democrats that he represented. Mm-hmm. Adlai Stevenson was much more cold or oriented than Kennedy was.
Did you ever have any particular political admiration for Nixon?
No. Well, I came to see him as an important instrument for the true cause, and I always gave him credit for his stand in the Hiss case. But he was the only one on that Senate committee who was not taken by Alger Hiss and by his WASP gentlemanly.
Yes.
So I never felt personally attracted to Nixon. I always felt that he was a very selfish person, but very smart. Afterwards, I discovered he had done the dumbest thing in 20th century politics when he got rid of Spiro Agnew.
His insurance policy, you mean?
Yes. And he should have burned the tapes, of course, but Spiro Agnew was a better firewall.
Yes.
Because, and I had a moment of admiration for Spiro Agnew, which I had reason to lose later on.